Welcome back, everyone. We are almost a week away from Lights Out in Australia. We've got a new season, new regulations, a new track, and a few new teams on the grid. There's a lot of excitement as we head into this 2026 season, and a lot of uncertainty as to what exactly this season will hold. So it only feels right to start off with a season preview, breaking down these new regulations. What do they entail, and what will they mean for how things look on track? And a breakdown of each of the 11 teams and my best guess as to what the pecking order will look like to start the season. And of course, finishing off with some livery rankings and championship predictions. I'm excited to kick off another season, and it's all coming up next on the Chicanery Podcast. There are a lot of things I like about F1 that separate it from other sports. The international aspect, traveling across the world in a 9-month span, seeing all of these different countries through our TVs. The glitz and the glamour that comes with each race weekend, how everyone, at least for us Americans, feels like a Super Bowl in this major event. The technical side of things and how each team is striving to exploit the gray areas of the rules to gain any advantage that they can get. But one of my favorite aspects is F1's willingness to fight against things getting too stagnant with these constant regulation changes. But why is it such a big deal this time? Well, for the first time, the regulation changes are happening for the chassis and power unit at the same time. Something we've never seen happen in this sport before. You look at the history. Chassis regulation changes occurred in 1983, 1998, 2009, 2021. The power unit regulation changes occurred in 89, 1994, and 2014. So it's a big deal this year for these teams because for the first time, both are happening at the same time, and that means double the effort to adjust to all of these changes. Now, the good news for us fans is history shows us when these regulation changes happen, it frequently causes a change in the pecking order. In fact, the last 4 regulation changes have seen a new Constructors' Champion in that first year of the new regulation cycle. So there's a good chance we could see that again and really see things mixed up. But what exactly are the changes for these regulations this year? The first is cars are a lot smaller. The wheelbase is reduced by 200 millimeters. The width of the car is reduced by 100 millimeters. The floor width is reduced by 150 millimeters. And the minimum weight is reduced by 30 kilograms. So each one on its own doesn't seem that significant. But when you look at it as a whole, when you look at the 2026 car compared to the size of the 2025 car, it's a significant change in size, which is something that a lot of these drivers have been complaining about for the past few years, that the cars have just gotten too big. You can't race how you want to. So something that should be a good change for the sport in that area. But it's not just the size of the cars. It's exactly how the cars operate too. Because we've reached the end of the ground effect era. No more tunnels underneath the car that divert airflow in different directions. We're back to the flatter floors that we've seen in previous generations. But with that means less downforce. So a big change in how these cars react on track. And also on top of that too, the floors were a huge area of development in the last generation cycle. So that could be a huge detriment to teams like McLaren, Red Bull, who really excelled in that area and used that area of the car to really gain an advantage over their competitors. There's another big change to how these cars operate, and that's with active aero. No more DRS. Kind of. The rear wing is still similar to DRS. We don't have DRS zones anymore, but you can open the wings on the straights. But in reality, concept's kind of the same. What is different is there's no requirement that you have to be within a second of the car ahead. There's just going to be designated areas of the track where this can be used. But, like I said, drivers can use it at any time they're in those areas, no matter how far or how close they are to the car in front of them. But the biggest change with the active aero is really with the front wing, because that's going to flatten and open up too. And in the same areas on those straights and in those designated areas on track, but it operates the same as the rear wing. The wings flatten out, increases the airflow, increases the speed of the car. Now, both of them are still going to be closed through the corners to maintain grip. And of course, we all remember Jack doing in Suzuka last year, trying to keep his DRS open through the first corner and just completely losing the car. So probably a necessary thing there to make sure that these cars are staying on track. But Also, with the front wings, too, they're going to look a little bit different, too. Much more simplified, much more narrow, and also, too, the end plates have moved inwards, which is going to be a big area for development with these teams. And we've already seen a lot of different approaches in this area throughout testing. But also, too, another thing that probably a team like McLaren has to watch out for is with this new front wing configuration, what does that mean for tire temperature? Will these teams still be able to preserve the tires the same way that they were in the last generation? Definitely something to watch out for. It's not just the front wings. We've got different modes with how these cars operate and how these power units operate too. The first being overtake mode. Some shades of DRS with the old regulations where you do have to be within a second of the car in front to activate it. But activating overtake mode gives the car extra electrical energy that'll help them overtake the car in front. And there will be designated areas of the track where this can be used, similar to DRS zones that we've seen in previous years. But on top of that, we've also got the boost button. Kind of similar to what we've seen in IndyCar with push to pass. It's a mode that's going to give the car extra electrical energy to give that car maximum power to help with the overtakes and help just give it maximum speed as it's navigating traffic. Now, this can be used anywhere on track and can be used when a driver is trying to overtake or trying to defend from an overtake. So a little more flexibility with how and where it can be used. But with all of these new modes, leads to our next change, and that's with the power units. Because with the power units, we're going to a 50-50 split between sustainable fuel and electric power. In the previous generation, we had about an 80-20 split between those two, so a pretty significant change. And of course, it's in the name of fuel sustainability, but also, too, just allowing the cars to have this electric power needed for these new modes with the boost button and overtake mode. A lot of concerns, though, with how exactly this is going to look on track and how much management is going to go into just utilizing these different modes to the best that they can. It's going to take a lot to preserve the necessary battery to make an overtake work. We saw that in testing, just with how quickly these batteries will drain on the straights when these modes are activated and when these drivers are trying to make an overtake work. And it takes a lot of management to recharge that battery throughout a lap. You just can't go flat out anymore. And we saw a great example in testing from Kimi Antonelli in Bahrain going through turn 12, where he really had to back off to have enough battery power for that next straight leading into the final corners. That's not the only concern. There are a few others, because overall the biggest question is, was this regulation change good for the sport? Because the biggest problem that we had with the last generation, and we heard it time and time again from all different drivers, the cars were too big. It was impossible to overtake. It was impossible to follow the car in front. And these cars and these new regulations were tailored to allow for more overtaking. But unfortunately, with what we've seen from testing, it looks like there could be problems there. Again, we see these modes activated. The batteries are draining right away. Halfway through the overtake attempt, the car's out of battery. And they're losing pace and falling behind. And then that car defending is losing battery defending. And it's just back and forth. So something that can be a little frustrating for drivers. But at the same time, could it be good for racing? Could it allow for a little more chaos on track and a little just more uncertainty with how these overtakes are going to work? But it's not just that. It's not just the battery power. The start procedure looks like it's going to be a little rough. In the last generation cycle, lights start to go out, or the 5 lights start to go on. About the 4th one, cars start to rev their engine, get it up to the required RPMs, release the clutch, they're off. It's very different this year. Start procedure is probably going to include about 10 seconds of these cars revving their engines to get the necessary battery power to make it off the line and make it down that first straight and make it through the first lap. It's not going to be pretty. And I would expect a lot of issues. We saw a few practice starts in testing. It was chaotic. A lot of cars going into anti-stall. A lot of cars just very, very slow starts, but there was one that was very, very good at their starts, and that was Ferrari, which we'll get to in a second. But for the rest of the field, it wasn't pretty. And these starts are probably not going to be pretty, and I wouldn't be surprised if the FIA keeps a very close eye on the start procedure, and we see a few changes to just exactly how the start procedure goes as the season goes on. But with all of these changes, to the power unit specifically, just to how these cars operate, the different modes, I'm expecting to see a lot of mechanical failures in DNFs throughout the season, which is something we haven't really seen in the last generation cycle. We've become very accustomed to seeing the majority of these cars make it through the entire race. All of them make it to the finish line. It's something that we've seen in previous generations, the early 2010s, 2000s, where DNFs, mechanical failures, it was just part of racing. It was part of the sport. And I think we're going back to that. So definitely a change for these teams, but from a fan standpoint, probably something that's going to give us a little bit of intrigue and a little bit of chaos. And again, we're probably going to have a little bit of an ugly patch with these new regulations. It's probably not going to be what we want it to be, at least at the start. And it might take a whole season, maybe even a few seasons, to perfect and for the FIA to really get on top of these. But for the time being, as ugly as it might lead to some chaos. It might lead to some very unpredictable races, which could be intriguing from a fan perspective. All right, now that we've gotten the regulations out of the way, let's start talking about these teams and what I think is going to be the pecking order, at least heading into the first weekend in Australia. I might regret saying this. I might look back in 2 months and say, you were such an idiot. But I am cautiously optimistic. This could be Ferrari's year. You never know with preseason testing, but from what we've seen so far, Ferrari looks like they might be the best team to start the season. They unveiled a lot of innovative designs to their car during testing. The reverse rotating rear wing flap, which I have a lot of questions as to how exactly this works. Wouldn't it give the car more lift instead of downforce? But at the same time, I realize I don't have an engineering degree, so I'm going to defer to those with a higher mind. But just a very, very unique trick that Ferrari has used with their rear wing. But also, too, the shield behind the exhaust that's supposed to give them more downforce. But more importantly, is how far ahead of their competitors they look to be on race starts. That's another controversy that I touched on a second ago with this new generation of cars. And it's probably going to be the first of many this season as the teams begin to interpret these regulations and figure them out on track. But like I was saying, with the two new power units, the cars have to rev for about 10 seconds to charge their batteries enough for the race start. Very different than the last generation. And the drivers are pretty worried about this, and rightfully so based on what we've seen with the practice starts and preseason testing. It sounded awful, and it looked even worse. Handful of cars going into anti-stall. Really slow starts off the line for a lot of the others. Except for Ferrari, and especially Lewis Hamilton. They have these race starts nailed down, and that could give them a huge advantage, at least to start the season. But it's not just the race starts. Ferrari looks very, very fast. And of course, there's a question of were they sandbagging, were the other top teams sandbagging, which is always a valid concern in testing because it's something that we've seen year in and year out. But for this year, going into a new regulation cycle, with all of these changes, all of these unknowns, I have a hard time believing that teams were sandbagging during testing because to me, it just doesn't seem like it would be to their benefit. And it seems like it would be very detrimental to not push these cars flat out, see what type of performance they have at their peak, and really figure these things out before we get to that first race weekend. But with Ferrari, if they're not sandbagging, if they're really at the top, like it looks like they might be, who's going to be that number one driver? Who's going to be in the top contention to win the Drivers' Championship this year? Everything would tell you it would probably be Charles Leclerc. He's younger. He's still in his prime. He's performed so much better than Lewis in that last year, outscoring him 242 to 156. So logic tells you that Charles will probably be that top Ferrari driver and the logical favorite to win the title based on what we've seen so far. But could we get a Lewis resurgence? Things looked bad last year, but he seems like he's put it all behind him heading into this season, and he looks very refreshed and with a completely new mindset. He, of course, is getting a new race engineer, which is probably much needed. I think a little bit of blame probably goes on both with how ugly that ended up being last season. But regardless, you couldn't do that another year. A change needed to be made. And realistically for Lewis, too, when you look at these new generations of cars, they're smaller. They're faster through the corners. It's a car that really suits Lewis's driving style. And if I'm a betting man, Probably still putting my money on Charles Leclerc to be that number one driver, but I think it'll be a lot closer than people expect. And I do fully expect that Lewis will end that ugly podium streak where he just hasn't hit the mark with Ferrari. And maybe he wins a few races this season too. Could this be it for him though? Could this be his last season? It's hard to tell. The better the season goes, the probably less likely it is because he also has to worry about his contract with Ferrari too. Will they be willing to bring him on past 2026 and give him a new deal? So the better he performs, the more likely that becomes. And also too, just from a confidence standpoint, the better he's performing, the more he's going to believe himself and the more he's going to believe he still has something to give to this sport. And he still has a say in these championship fights before he's ready to hang things up. But if it does turn into a struggle, like it was last year, wouldn't be surprising at all to see him say, you know what, maybe I just don't have it anymore. Maybe these cars are just out of my area of expertise and it's time to hang things up and move on to other things in life. A little bit of pressure on Charles Leclerc, though, if Ferrari really is as good as they look to be. He had a taste of that championship fight in 2022, but his own errors and Red Bull's development caught up to him, and that just slowly went out of the picture for him. But after that, he really hasn't had another valid shot at competing for a championship thanks to Ferrari's struggles. There's a very good chance he's in that fight with Max, with George, maybe even a few others that we don't expect. But at the end of the day, we all know Charles Leclerc has the talent to make this championship push and ultimately become a driver's champion. He just hasn't had the opportunity to do so, but that opportunity might be here for this year. Because if Leclerc ends his career without a championship, it's probably going to be Ferrari more than him. So the burning question, we've been here so many times. Ferrari looks like a favorite heading into the season. But is it going to all fall apart when the races start? Is it going to be performance, strategy errors, a little bit of both? Because right now, looking at things, it seems like they still have the drivers to follow through. It's just inside the building. Can they put it all together? And again, I might regret saying this in a few months, but I think this might be the year that Ferrari finally puts it all together. Who's going to be their biggest competitor, though? Probably Mercedes, which is a team that we all expected to be at the top heading into this new regulation cycle. And there's a lot of pressure on Mercedes to win the title because of that. Because we've been hearing for almost a year that they have a clear advantage with the new power units. This is a team with a proven track record of success throughout multiple eras of the sport. And they've got a driver in George Russell that looks to be ready to make that next step and compete for a championship. And now is realistically the time for him to make that leap in his career if he is championship material. But after testing, does Mercedes still look like the favorites? They look strong, but not clearly ahead of the rest of the field. And of course, there's the excuse of were they sandbagging? Was there hidden performance that they're just not showing us? Again, I have a hard time seeing that heading into this new regulation cycle with all of these changes and just how important testing is in a year like this year. But if Mercedes has any advantage with the new power units, if they do end up at the top, how long is that going to last? Because what it seems to come down to is this innovative engine ratio trick that they seem to come up with that's already been very controversial. So under the new regulations, no cylinder of the engine may have a geometric compression ratio greater than 16:1. Under the current interpretation, the test to make sure they're within that ratio is conducted when the engine has cooled off, not when the engine is hot. So why is that such a big advantage for Mercedes? They've designed their pistons in the engine to change shape under extreme heat when the car is running at full performance. The change in shape allows for a hidden chamber that seals off, which reduces the cylinder volume and increases the compression ratio above that 16:1 ratio limit. There's still speculation as to how much the compression ratio increases for them, but it seems likely that it's going up to 18:1 or at least pretty close to it. So what does that mean for things on track? What do those numbers translate to? About a 15 to 40 increase in horsepower, which amounts to about 3 to 4 tenths gain per lap. Now the other four engine suppliers, Ferrari, Honda, Ford, Audi, they're all pushing for a change in the regulations, so these tests are conducted when the engines are hot, which would make the Mercedes engine illegal. And as of now, it looks like the FIA will still conduct these tests when the engines are cool, but changes could be coming during the summer break. And at that point, the tests are going to be conducted when the engines are hot and cool. And that could have a huge impact on the season. Because either Mercedes has a drop off in performance when these new tests start, or they find a way to minimize any drop off in performance when the tests change, but that probably compromises their development in other areas of their car leading up to that point. And it's not just Mercedes that we're talking about. It's all of their customers too. McLaren, Williams, Alpine. Over a third of the grid is going to be affected by this. Now, the interesting twist to all of this is that Red Bull was initially on Mercedes' side, but they've changed their tune and are now pushing for a change, and the speculation is that they've changed their stance because they couldn't replicate the engine trick. Just typical Red Bull, and something that frustrates me and is a reason why I don't root for Red Bull. I respect them, but it just seems like this always happens where they realize there's a loophole and they try to get on it, they try to skirt around the rules, and then if they can't do it, they turn into a tattletale and run to the FIA and say, oh, we need to stop this. This is illegal. This is ridiculous, when they're trying to accomplish the same thing. But I digress. But Red Bull's change position on the matter is crucial because a change to the regulations this close to the start of the season requires a supermajority vote from the engine suppliers. They need 4 of them to be on the same page, and that's what they have now with Red Bull's change stance. So definitely something to watch out for as the season progresses and how the FIA interprets this issue and where they decide to go with it. There's also another issue for Mercedes and their customers to worry about, and that comes with the fuel. So under the new regulations, the cars need to run on 100% sustainable fuel. And to ensure this, the FAA requires that fuel suppliers pass a certification process to ensure that the fuel meets those sustainability requirements. So far, Shell has passed the test, and they supply fuel for Ferrari, Haas, and Cadillac. BP has passed the test. They supply fuel for Audi. ExxonMobil has passed the test, who they're supplying fuel for Red Bull and Racing Bulls. But not Petronas, who supplies fuel for Mercedes, McLaren, Williams, and Alpine. And also not Aramco, which supplies fuel for Aston Martin, but we're going to get to that a little later. I don't think we have anything to worry about, any effects on Aston Martin with how far they look down the order. But the other problem is it's a much more involved process to get this fuel approved. So Petronas, this might not be an overnight fix. This is something that could take weeks for them to get if they're running into roadblocks. But before this year, teams used fossil fuels, and they were tested in a lab affiliated with the FAA. Much easier to go through that process. But now the FAA has contracted out the testing process, and the process just doesn't involve testing the fuel, but testing the entire production process. A lot more involvement and a lot more eyes on just how the entire system works. So what used to be a very quick process can become very drawn out, and that's definitely a concern for Petronas, especially this close to Australia, and we still haven't gotten any word that they've passed the test. There is still another week to get things sorted out, but what will things look like if they can't? It's not going to be a situation where the cars can't run at all in Australia. If they can't get the fuel approved, they'll have to run a provisional fuel, which will be suitable, but is likely going to limit the overall performance of the car. And realistically, this will probably only be a problem for Australia, maybe China. After that, you would expect Petronas to figure it out if they haven't already. So we're probably not looking at a season-long problem, but definitely something that could impact the first few race weekends. For Mercedes, though, if they figure things out, if they are at the top of the order, and they're in championship contention, can George Russell handle the pressure of a championship fight? You look at his past, he's had a lot of issues handling those high-pressure moments. 2020 in Imola, he was headed for his first points, spun out behind the safety car, sent his car into the barriers, threw those chances out the window. 2023 in Canada, he was running fourth, looking strong, crashes into the wall on lap 12 out of nowhere, causes damage, ultimately retires from that race. And then, of course, 2023 in Singapore, chasing down Carlos Sainz and Lando Norris for the race win, clips the barriers in the final laps, ends his race. And we've seen a lot of other moments in qualifying too, where the pressure ramps up and George just kind of cracks under it. Very similar to what we've seen with Lando in the past. And it's something that can be overcome, but typically it takes at least a year of really being in the fight and falling short before a driver figures things out. And I'm a little worried this might be George's figuring it out year. If he's going to win, he might need a clear advantage with his car. Similar to what we've seen with McLaren in the last few years. where it's just so far ahead of the rest of the field that he can afford a few mistakes here and there and still have that buffer and that wiggle room to make up for it in the standings. I just don't know if he's going to have that this year in that performance advantage because, like I was saying, Ferrari looks pretty strong. And these other teams, Red Bull, McLaren, they're probably behind Mercedes right now, but they're not that far off. And there's definitely room for them to improve and close that gap. But there's not just the championship pressure for George this year. There's this added pressure with the contract he signed at the end of the last year, which again, the terms are undisclosed. We're probably never going to know what those terms are until it's all said and done and he's left the team or moved on to his next contract. And that's typical with what we see in Formula One. Rarely do we get all of these contract details. But George has admitted he's guaranteed a 2027 seat with Mercedes if he finishes high enough in the standings. Now, is that based on his performance alone? Does he have to finish a certain amount of points ahead of Kimi? That's something we don't know and might not ever know. But it is clear that 2027 with Mercedes is highly dependent on how he performs this year. And it makes sense because for Mercedes, it became clear that they wanted Max last year. And when that no longer became an option, Mercedes pivoted to make sure they had flexibility for 2027 to sign Max. And with these contractual terms, Mercedes has put themselves in a really good position to make that happen if it becomes a possibility. So, either George proves himself and they have a championship contending number one driver already on contract and already with the team, or George doesn't meet that mark and they have the flexibility to lure Max away from Red Bull if Max decides he wants to make that move. But either way, there's a very realistic possibility that Mercedes has a number one driver who can take them all the way. And even if George does perform well and meets those expectations, it's not impossible that they can still end up with Max too. Because there's going to be a lot more pressure on Kimi Antonelli to perform this year as well. When all of the Max rumors were circulating last year, it was hard to imagine Mercedes cutting ties with Kimi to bring on Max. Solely for the reason that Kimi was a rookie and he's been touted as this generational talent. You just can't walk away from that after 1 year and let him join another team. But if we're being honest, Kimi's rookie season wasn't spectacular and wasn't meeting the mark as far as the expectations and where things were heading into the season and how highly he was touted. There were definitely some great moments. P3 in Canada for his first podium, P2 in Brazil, another P3 in Vegas. But there were a lot of disappointing moments too. That middle part of the season sandwiched around the Canada performance. 4 DNFs, a P16, a P18 in 7 races, a handful of disappointing qualifying results, and a few moments where the pressure clearly got to him and caused some errors like we saw in that infamous moment in Qatar when he went off track at the end of the race and lost position to Lando. Now, Kimi did do enough to guarantee a seat this year, but not enough to guarantee a seat for 2027 and beyond. And that's the pressure Kimi is facing this year. If he underperforms again, and George is firmly in the championship fight, and Max wants to make that move to Mercedes, it's going to make a lot more sense to let Kimi go at that point. I don't think it's going to get to that point, though. Rookie years are tough, and rarely is a rookie as young as Kimi was last year able to put in those results that we expect. And maybe the expectations were a little bit too high. And it's rare to have a rookie at one of the top teams dealing with that level of pressure at the same time, too. So I think we do see a solid leap from Kimi this year. He might not finish ahead of George in the standings, but I do expect him to really close that gap and show off his talent that people have been talking about for the last 2 years. So I've got Ferrari and Mercedes at the top, but realistically, the top 4 teams are probably still going to be the top 4 teams. And coming in at third, heading into the season, I've got Red Bull. They had a very solid testing period and look like they should be somewhere at the top. Now, of course, we're going to have a much better picture in Australia, but I think Red Bull's shown enough to say, hey, they're going to be up there competing with Ferrari and Mercedes for race wins, which is a little surprising considering they left Honda as an engine supplier last year and have started this new program with Ford, and it's just very hard to make that work with a new supplier, especially in a year where the regulations change to this degree. But Red Bull and Ford look like they have a good handle on this new venture together, which is just incredibly impressive. Now, there are still going to be hiccups. Again, with all of these teams, I'm expecting a lot more mechanical issues, a lot more DNFs, retirements, but there are probably also going to be some other bumps in the road for this team outside of the power units, just as they're learning how to work with Ford and figuring all of this out. But again, for Red Bull to already be here and be in this position heading into the season has to be a huge confidence boost for the team. And even as the third best team, I still have Max Verstappen as a title favorite with Charles and George. I mean, you'd be stupid not to, right? We learned last year, even when he has an obvious disadvantage with his car, he's still going to be in the picture. I try to hide it. I probably don't do a good job. Max rubs me the wrong way a lot with his comments, his approach, his racing tactics. There are a lot of things that irritate me, but there's no denying it. No denying his greatness. No denying the fact that he gets everything out of any car that he gets into. And no denying that he is the most talented driver in the sport right now, and it's really not that close. The bad thing for Max is he hates this new generation of cars. The good news for Max is he could very well thrive in it. Because when you look at how complicated the new cars are with all of the new modes, how much you have to manage the car throughout the lap, the more skilled drivers are just going to separate themselves that much more. And I can see Max really getting a handle on these cars much better and much faster than the rest of the field. And even if they start the season as the third best team, we know Red Bull has the personnel in the facility to outdevelop their competitors as the season goes on, like we saw last year as they closed the gap to McLaren. Now, one little concerning thing, Craig Skinner, the chief designer for the last 20 years with the team, abruptly resigned 2 weeks ago. Concerning. Not what you want to happen to start the season, but especially starting a season like this. But at the same time, I have faith in Laurent Mekies leading this team in the right direction, because what we saw last year, when they got rid of Christian Horner and brought Laurent in to lead the team, that's when things started to turn around. And I think that was the change that Red Bull really needed. And I think even Max sees that at this point now. So even with that departure, it is a big departure. It's not anything to scoff at, but I think they'll be able to weather the storm with Laurent. But with Max, he's probably going to have a pretty decent year this year. But could the end be nearing for his F1 future? He was asked about his future recently and said the new generation of cars isn't helping his chances of staying in F1 for a while. He's made comments throughout testing about how much he hates the new generation of cars, how he can't push flat out, how it's not real racing and just kind of doesn't excite him. And of course, he's made prior comments about wanting to do other racing series, which we've seen him start to do, and spending more time with his family, which we know he had his first child last year. And of course, he's made a lot of other prior comments about important people staying at Red Bull and how most of them are gone now. And it seems like everything Max has been warning us about over the last few years has either already happened or is currently happening. Now, him leaving F1, I don't see it happening just yet. Even if he hates the new cars, winning should put a smile on his face and give him that desire to keep racing for a little bit longer. And I do believe him that it's close. I do think he's going to step away at some point in the near future and go to those other racing series and give his life just a little more flexibility that he desires. But I think 2028 looks a lot more realistic as far as a departure date based on how his contract looks and based on how Red Bull will probably look this year too. But if things go off the rails with Red Bull, and it's a nightmare situation for them this year, it's not impossible for that timeline to get sped up a little bit. It's just hard to see that happening, especially after last year, where it looked like one of those years, and Max still found himself right in the middle of the championship fight until the very end. And on top of that, too, if things really are that bad at Red Bull, it's probably going to be a seat open at Mercedes if he wants it. Going across the garage, though, it's a big year for Max's teammate Isaac Hadjar. His first season at the top team and a very well-deserved promotion. He, of course, had that awful start to the season last year in Australia, but overall, he had a great rookie campaign and showed a lot of promise and potential. But as we all know, that second Red Bull seat has seemed cursed since Daniel Ricciardo left the team at the end of 2018. Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon, Sergio Perez, Liam Lawson, Yuki Tsunoda, no one has been able to survive next to Max. And ironically, Sergio probably received the most criticism, but has probably done the best job out of all of those drivers looking back with hindsight. But the evidence is very clear. It is a difficult position to be in, being Max Verstappen's teammate. Alex Albon said it best a few years ago, and I think I talked about this in one of my episodes last year, but just explaining how Max likes a car that has such a sensitive front end, very similar to the mouse on a computer, and having the sensitivity turned all the way up where that mouse is just darting back and forth across the screen. And on top of that, too, like we saw really with Checo the most, as time goes on, the team is going to favor Max's driving style, and the car is going to be developed with that in mind. And that's where we've seen the most of the problems with that second Red Bull driver. On top of the fact that Max is just so good, you're going to get destroyed by him week in and week out, and your confidence is probably going to take a hit anytime you get on track with him. But for Isaac, coming into the team right now, at the start of these new regulations, is probably the best timing he could possibly have. He's starting with a completely clean slate with these new regulations. The car isn't necessarily favoring Max yet. And because of that, I think we're going to see some strong performances from Isaac, at least to start the year. But as time goes on, we reach the midpoint of the season, after Max starts giving feedback, and enough time passes to develop some upgrades, that's when things could change for Isaac, and it's something for him to watch out for. But the other benefit is, Isaac's driving style is probably as close to Max's as we've seen from any of his teammates. He likes the sensitive, sharp front end like Max. So as time goes on and the car gets developed further into the regulations, it might not be to Isaac's detriment like we've seen with other drivers. Now for Isaac too, and just solely for him, it's probably also going to help that Helmut Marko isn't there anymore. And I don't want to be disrespectful. Helmut's had a lot of success in this sport. But all of the comments that he's made over the years about that second driver, without a doubt, made the situation so much worse than it needed to be. Just the constant belittling of that second driver to the media, telling them they're terrible, telling the media that they're terrible, threatening all of these changes and driver switches and this and that. It has been a terrible environment for that second driver because of all those comments that he's made and his approach to how he just manages this team. So with Helmut gone, again, he's had a lot of success in this sport. He deserves that respect. But for Isaac especially, being that young driver, I think it's probably a good thing that he's coming into this team with Helmut gone. And for Isaac too, history might not be on his side, but I have a lot of hope that he can make this second Red Bull seat work and be here for a long time. Now this might be a little surprise after two pretty dominant seasons, but I've got McLaren fourth in the pecking order to start the year. And sometimes that's what happens the first year of the new regulations. Now, there's a chance they might have been sandbagging too, but again, I just don't think so. There are too many unknowns in the first year of a new regulation cycle, and too much are compromising by having that approach in testing. There are two areas of the new regulations that are probably going to hurt McLaren the most, though. No more intricate floors, diverting the airflow in different directions, which is an area where they excelled in the last regulation cycle, and those simpler rear and front wings, an area where they also excelled with wing flexibility, although it was a little controversial at times. But going off of that too, their ability to save the tires and maintain tire temperature and just extend those stints longer than anyone else, that was something that came down to the front wings. And now those front wings are completely different, and McLaren has probably lost that advantage. Now, I haven't seen any signs that they'll struggle in that area with tire development, but at the same time, a lot of things are hidden in testing, and we're just not going to get that an honest analysis. So something I'm really going to keep my eye on as we head into that first weekend in Australia. But even though this McLaren car doesn't look as dominant as it did in the last 2 years, they're still in the top four, and I think they're still close enough to the rest to close that gap throughout the season. And we've seen them do it before with the same people not that long ago in 2023. So for McLaren fans, including myself, we might need to be a little more patient, readjust our expectations for a little bit, but I think things are going to come back around, which is tough, especially for Oscar, coming off of last season's disappointment, because what he needs the most after losing that championship lead and ultimately losing the championship to his teammate, he needs to get back into a dominant car. He needs to start the season off with some wins and put last season behind him, get back on top in the driver's standings, and just start off with some strong momentum to start the year. But he probably isn't going to get that this year. It'll be interesting to see what his confidence levels look like to start the season. Where is he mentally? Is last season's collapse just completely forgotten about, put behind him? Or is it something that's going to carry over a little bit into this year and something that he's going to continue to work on and get over? I'd like to think it would be the former. He seemed to take it all on the chin last year when the title slipped away from him. Again, very impressed with how he handled that last race and just kind of kept his head up and again, took it on the chin and just showed a lot of maturity in that moment. And on top of that, too, Abu Dhabi was a pretty good race for him, too, to end the season. So hopefully this is just another chapter in his career and a moment of growth for him instead of something that hangs over his head for years to come. But definitely something for us to watch out for as we head into these first few race weekends. For his teammate, though, I think it's a completely different story for Lando. I'm expecting to see a much more confident version of him now that he has a championship under his belt. Confidence and self-doubt, there's no hiding it. He's been very open about it. Those have been his biggest issues throughout his entire career. And a lot of people looked at him at a young age early in his career and said, yep, this kid has what it takes to be a world champion. But once it went from him outperforming a midfield car to meeting the expectations of driving a competitive car, everything changed. The pressure changed and the pressure clearly got into his head. And we saw it even more the last 2 years when we all knew if he was going to win a championship, this was the moment to do it. And this might be his only moment to do it. But now he's done it. He's reached the highest point in the sport. He's got nothing left to prove. He's won races. He's won the championship. He's drivers, constructors. He's done it all. He's accomplished everything that probably he set out to accomplish at the start of his F1 career. And I think that's going to go a very long way with his mental approach. But on top of that, when you look at these new cars, the driving style, and what it's going to take to excel in these new cars, just like it suits Lewis, I think it suits Lando too. He likes the sharper front end that gives you more cornering speed. So it's probably not going to be a 2024 or 2025 season, but I still think it'll be a very good season for Lando and one where we come away very impressed with some of his results and one where we come away very impressed with his confidence. And that goes for Oscar too. Maybe not on the confidence side, but I think we are still going to get some very, very strong results from him. Because at the end of the day, this is still one of the strongest lineups in F1, and that'll still be something that can carry these cars a long way, even when their performance isn't where they want it to be. The car might not be what they've grown accustomed to the past 2 years, but I do still expect podiums for either driver, and I expect them to be mixing things up at the top from time to time. Let's talk some midfield teams. This one, probably a little bit of a surprise, and it definitely was coming out of testing, but I think I have Alpine as the top midfield team and the fifth best team heading into the season. They looked really strong in testing, and again, I think that means something this year. And it makes sense with how early they closed up shop on the development of last year's car and turned their focus to 2026. On top of that, too, it's their first year with Mercedes power units and not Renault, and I think that's something that's going to go a long way for them this season. But also, Alpine is doing some very interesting things with their own car design too. I am really intrigued by their rear wing and how it opens up with active aero. The wing doesn't have a top crossbar like we see on the rest of the cars, and it practically just collapses on itself. So I'm very curious to see how is this going to play out. Is this something that's going to give them extra performance and something that's going to be copied by the other teams? Or are we going to get a few months down the line and realize, all right, this is actually not giving them any additional performance or is hurting them in some way? But if this team is climbing up the midfield ranks, it's going to be thanks to Pierre Gasly. His fourth year on the team, he's clearly the number one driver, and deservedly so. As bad as that car was last year, he still managed to finish in the points 5 times, which probably would have been impossible for a lot of the other drivers on the grid. But there was a very significant gap between Pierre and Franco last year, and unfortunately, I think that's probably going to continue. Franco had a really disappointing 2025 season after what we saw in 2024 when he filled in for Williams. The thing for Franco, though, is last year he could get away with it because of where that car was. Again, Pierre was finishing in the points from time to time, but that was just a nice surprise. No one on the team expected that, and it was a lot easier to accept all of the mistakes that Franco had last year and all of just the bottom of the order finishes that he had. This year, probably a different story. If this team is competing for points on a consistent basis, or should be competing for points on a consistent basis, and Franco's still making those mistakes and not putting in the results, Flavio Briatore is not going to put up with it. Which begs the question, will Franco make it through the whole season? We've seen Flavio do it time and time again. He's not shy to make a driver change mid-season if he feels like it's the right move. And that could be the future that Franco is looking at this year. Now, I think the year will probably be better for him, but is it going to be enough? The good thing for him, sponsorships. It clearly kept him in this seat for 2026, and it could keep him in the seat throughout the end of the year. The other good thing is there aren't really any reserve drivers at Alpine that they seem to believe in who would replace him if a mid-season switch was made. Maybe Alex Dunn, who's coming up from F2 and had, a lot of success there. Some controversy, but a lot of success and probably some potential that a lot of teams see. But the other reserve driver is Paul Aaron. And no shot at Paul Aaron, but if they believed in him, he'd be in that seat by now. So it looks like Franco, it might be ugly. I think he'll do enough to keep it, but still something to watch out for. But at the end of the day, if they get rid of Franco, who are they going to bring in that they expect to be better? So for Alpine, again, I expect them to be fifth in performance. I expect them to be the top midfield team based on what we've seen, but this might be a knockoff version of what we've seen with Red Bull over the last few years. Not at the top of the standings, but a team that's carried completely by one driver and loses ground in the constructor standings because of that second driver. For the sixth best team, I think I got Haas. And I don't think they're that far off from Alpine either. They definitely look like they'll be in the mix for some consistent points finishes this year. And they likely have an advantage using the Ferrari power units. Again, much easier start procedure with those power units. They've looked very reliable throughout testing too, which gave them a lot of data to back up how they want to progress throughout this season. And on top of that too, they just looked fast. Now, for the drivers, I'm expecting Ollie Beerman to make a big leap this year. We saw him take the reins at the end of last year. He started the season strong, had that mid-season dip, which is expected for a rookie, but then 5 points finishes in the final 7 races, highlighted by that P4 in Mexico City. He is a really talented driver, and it's expected that he'll be at a top team eventually, and it might not be that far away. He has the obvious ties to Ferrari, being one of their development drivers. He, of course, filled in for Carlos Sainz a few years ago in Jeddah. There's no doubt that Ollie has his eyes on Ferrari, and Ferrari has their eyes on him. And there's been a lot of chatter this offseason about where Charles Leclerc might go after his contract runs out. Are they going to renew Lewis after this year? It's not unrealistic that Ollie could be driving for Ferrari next year, but that comes with a different type of pressure for this year. He's already dealt with it to an extent with all of these ties and connections to Ferrari, but this year probably gets a little more real. And he needs to avoid a bad season to avoid giving Ferrari any doubt that he belongs on that team the next time they decide to make a driver switch. And I think he's going to take care of business on his end this season. The one question I do have, though, is how well he'll be able to adapt to this new generation of cars. It's just a completely different driving experience behind the wheel with the different modes you have to manage. And it's something that probably, if anyone, from a group generally, it's going to be the younger drivers that struggle the most. And there's been talk that, it's something that they're not used to. And it's something that the older drivers can draw back to previous generations and prior experience in the 2000s, 2010s, if they go back that far. And it'll start to come back to them. And it'll just be a much steeper learning curve for those younger drivers. But with the way we saw him outperform that car last year, I do still have confidence that it might be a little bit of a rough start, but he's going to be able to figure things out. For his teammate, though, a little worried about Esteban Ocon's future and what that'll look like after this season if Ollie makes that expected leap. Because for Esteban, his contract expires at the end of the year, so it's honestly a natural question to ask about will the team continue with him or will they want to look in a different direction. And that's no shot at Esteban. He's a good driver. Of course, had that win in Hungary in 2021. He's got a handful of podiums. But he's been in this sport since 2016. And his performance just haven't blown anyone away. He's been good, just not great. In those great performances, the win in Hungary, the other podiums, a lot of them, there's been a lot of luck that comes into play. and it's not necessarily just a pure skill type of result. And it could be very likely that if he maintains status quo this year, it could be enough for Haas to want to keep him on the team a little longer. But what if there's someone else climbing up through the junior ranks that gets Haas's attention? And it becomes a question of, all right, do we want to re-sign this 30-year-old driver who's been in the sport for a decade and we've probably seen all that he can show us? He's reached his prime in the sport. Or do we want to take a shot at a younger driver and look towards the future? One thing I do think Esteban probably has going for him is this possibility of Ollie making the move to Ferrari in the near future. Because if that happens, will the team want to start fresh with two young drivers? Or will Ollie's departure open the door for that young driver to come in and Esteban remains in that mentorship role that he's been in for the past year? And if that becomes a scenario, the answer to that question probably comes down to Esteban's performances this season. If he meets expectations, it's probably safe. But if his performances really take a dive, it'll make it a lot easier for the team to make the decision to say, maybe we should just start fresh with two new drivers instead. But even with all of that uncertainty, I'm expecting some really good things from Haas this year. I've got a lot of faith in the direction that Io Komatsu is taking this team, and he's already proven his worth with that late season surge that we saw from them last year. And all indications are that things will continue to trend in the upward direction for this team. Coming in at number 7, I've got Williams, and that's a pretty big disappointment. There's of course the possibility that they were sandbagging a little bit in testing, but again, I'll harp on it again, I have a hard time seeing that happening this year. But especially considering that Williams has missed the first preseason test in Barcelona, considering that they closed up shop on the development of last year's car, turned their focus to 2026 more than anyone, considering that there were rumors that they couldn't pass their crash test, that the car's overweight, they had so much time to figure all of this out and to show up at the start of this season in this state. It's not a good situation, and it's an embarrassing situation, and unfortunately, it's something that has happened to Williams before in the past, and is something they're a little too familiar with. Now, with all of these rumors about the crash tests and everything like that, of course, they came out, said, no, that's not the case. We've passed the crash test. We were just focusing more on managing production and really focusing on the Bahrain testing sessions and make sure we're getting the most out of it. And James Vowles released a statement saying that it was all part of the plan and blah, blah, blah. And I'm sorry, I just don't buy it. I like James. I think he's a really good leader. I think he's definitely pushing this team in the right direction. But remember last year when that video came out of him trying to record one of these team statements and it showed the outtakes and him starting over anytime he stumbled on a word or his tone wasn't right? That was a terrible thing to happen from a PR standpoint because, again, I think he's coming from a good place. I think he's leading this team in the right direction, but when things like this happen and when those statements get released and you look at him, it just makes you watch those videos in a different light. They just come across a little fake. Feels more like an acting job than honesty. So, do I think missing Barcelona in that testing period was all part of the plan? Absolutely not. But at this point, it is what it is. And Williams is left picking up the pieces and trying to play catch up to start the season. But what's even more disappointing is the performance we saw from them from testing when that car finally got on track. It wasn't great. They were dealing with too many issues. They just didn't have the pace. And again, this is a team that closed up shop on 2025 earlier than anyone. And a lot of people, including myself, expected them to really make a leap in performance this year and maybe even challenge the top 4 teams. And it looks like, if anything, they've taken a step back, not a step forward. The good news for them, though, is they do still have a very strong driver lineup. I am expecting Carlos Sainz to really step up and cement himself as the number 1 driver with this team. And we started to see a little bit of it at the end of last year. It was a harder start to the season compared to Albon's performances, but starting in Baku, Carlos was clearly the better driver. And it does make a lot of sense with him coming into a new team, learning how the car works, learning how the team operates, just getting his feet under him. It's a little bit of a reset this year with a new car, though. But I do expect Carlos to look a lot more comfortable to start this season. And I don't want to say all of that to shoot Alex down and make him seem like he's a bad driver. He's a really good driver and should put in some really good performances this year, too. But in my opinion, Carlos is one of the most underrated drivers in the sport. He didn't deserve to lose that Ferrari seat based on performance alone. And in all honesty, he's still a driver that probably deserves to be at a top team. I think the performances will improve as the season goes on for Williams, though, just because of this driver lineup and because of the input that they'll be able to give to the technical team and just kind of tailor this car to the new regulations. But the bad news is they're starting on their back foot again when they should be having one of the best starts they've ever had to a season. And that's going to be a tough pill to swallow all season long. Coming in at number 8, we've got the Racing Bulls. They're going to fall back down to earth a little bit this year for a couple reasons. The first is due to the new regulation cycle. Because if you remember, last year's car was basically a hand-me-down from Red Bull's 2024 car. And it was obvious that went a long way for them. But now this year, we're back to square one. And they, of course, can still rely on Red Bull, which is a separate issue in itself. But they're not getting handed an older spec of a championship contending car. And that's probably the biggest reason why I have them dropping down the order a little bit. But the other thing is, we've got a totally different driver lineup this year. Liam Lawson is still there, and he'll, of course, have his Liam Lawson moments, but we'll also have the much anticipated debut of Arvid Lindblad. And you never know until you see these guys get behind the wheel and handle these cars for the first times, but there's a lot of hype around Arvid, and a lot of people think he could be the next great young talent in the sport. And he very well might be, but it's going to come at the cost of a learning curve this year. There are going to be rookie mistakes. There are going to be some moments where he looks completely lost. And then you add in what we've already seen from Liam since he came into the sport in 2023, and I do understand why they kept him over Yuki, but if I'm being honest, I don't have a lot of faith that he's going to put in the type of performances the team wants to see. Just like we can expect rookie mistakes from Lindblad, we can probably expect Liam to make those same boneheaded mistakes that we've seen from him so many times in the last 3 years. There's something that tells me we might get a little tension between these two teammates too. It's not something that Liam is unfamiliar with, going wheel to wheel with a teammate and causing some tension within the team. And Arvid's going to want to prove himself. And Liam's going to want to do everything he can to make sure he finishes ahead of his rookie teammate. So it wouldn't surprise me if that led to some on-track moments between the two, because we know Liam can be somewhat of a magnet for that type of stuff. So all in all, I'm expecting some struggles for Racing Bulls this year, partially due to the car's performance, but even more so due to the drivers just shooting themselves in the feet. Coming in at number 9, we've got Audi, the artist formerly known as Sauber. A big year for them, making the transition to a new factory name, and even more so because they're transitioning from being a Ferrari customer to designing their own power units. And that can be a scary venture for a manufacturer that has no experience in the sport. But at the same time, they've been working on this project for years, since 2022. And to their benefit, the team personnel is generally the same as last year. They've just moved to a different facility. Switch team names. We're in a different polo now. So it's not really starting with a clean slate for them. It's really just moving everyone over and dealing with a new boss in charge. So the transition probably won't be as rough as we would think it would be with a new team, but I do still expect some rough spots as the year goes on. Let's talk about the drivers. Like I expect from Ollie Bierman, I'm expecting Gabriel Bortoleto to make a significant leap this year. I don't know if he'll be viewed as the number one driver when it's all said and done, but I do really think that he'll close that gap to Nico Hulkenberg. Because last year, Nico had a firm grasp on things. Outscored Gabriel 51-19, 9 points finishes to Gabriel's 5, and that's understandable for a rookie. No one's going to fault him for that, and he did have some pretty good moments throughout the year. Of course, the highlight being his performance in Hungary where he finished P6, but I don't think Gabriel can afford last year to happen again. Nico's 38 years old. He's going to be 39 when the season comes to an end. He's a really good driver, but realistically, his career is probably coming to a close. And if Gabriel has the talent to stay in this sport, he needs to be catching up in performance. The team needs to see that type of improvement from him this year. But I think he'll be able to deliver on that. Going to Nico, though, I don't know if what we'll see from him will be the same as what we saw last year. It's hard to imagine another podium or a special moment like we got in Silverstone, but at the same time, sometimes you never know. I guess you can't say it's impossible. But like I said a minute ago, Nico's 38. He's going to be 39 in August. He knows the reality that his time in the sport is limited, and this will probably be his last stop. But being a German born driver and finally driving for a German manufacturer, that's something that's going to be very special for him. And the good news for him from a performance standpoint is this new generation of cars should suit his driving style. Again, he's an older driver. I'm expecting the older drivers to just have a little bit of a better grasp on this stuff and draw them back to the previous generations. He remembers what it was like before the ground effect era. He remembers what it was like driving the smaller cars in the 2010s. And this is also a driver who's been through numerous regulation changes and has been able to adapt pretty well. So I think all of that will definitely play into his favor. But the real question is, when is Father Time going to start knocking on the door? When will we see that usual dip in performance that we see as drivers age and they reach their late 30s or even their 40s? And that might very well be his biggest hurdle this season. We've got another new team on the grid this year, Cadillac. And while you'd expect them to be at the bottom of the order, I've actually got them 10th. It's going to be a tough year for them coming into the sport. There's no getting around that. Unlike Audi, they're starting completely fresh. And as history has shown us, it takes years for these new teams to find success, if they find any at all. You look back at the recent additions. Haas came into the sport in 2016. Took them 3 seasons to finish 5th in the Constructors, which ended up being the highest finish they've ever had. Virgin Racing debuted in 2010. Finished last in the Constructors both years before eventually becoming Marussia F1 team, and they only made it as high as 9th in the Constructors standings before folding in 2015. And HRT also debuted in 2010, only made it to 11th in the standings in 3 seasons before folding. So, not easy. There are a few success stories with new teams, Braun in 2009, Red Bull becoming a title threat by their 5th year, but those were teams that were taking over existing teams like we're seeing with Audi right now. It's a totally different situation when you're starting from the ground up, and it's a very tough mountain to climb. So I don't expect a lot out of Cadillac this year from a performance standpoint, which is why it made a lot of sense to me for them to go with Sergio Perez and Valtteri Bottas as their driver lineup for this year. The results aren't going to be there. So don't waste your time with a young driver, because we've seen that's not usually a good recipe and can ruin that young driver's confidence and ultimately ruin their career. So to me, it makes a lot of sense to go with 2 experienced fan favorite drivers that have just a lot of valuable time in this sport. You can rely on them to lay a good foundation for this team and instill a championship mentality that they've both seen firsthand. You put 2 drivers in the car that aren't going to make those silly mistakes that lead to costly repairs that hinder the team and stop further development. And more importantly, especially for a team starting this new venture, capitalize on the endorsements and fanfare that they bring in when the results probably aren't going to be there. And then, in a few years, when this operation is hopefully up to speed, then it might be time to look in a younger direction. It would be awesome if we could see a points finish from Cadillac this year, but I wouldn't bank on it. There are definitely going to be some hard moments, but they just need to steady the ship and keep building towards the future with a little bit of patience in mind. And that brings us to our final team, Aston Martin. Williams testing was a disappointment, but things are about as bad as they can get at Aston Martin right now. Just a litany of problems that they had to deal with in testing. That Honda engine looks like an absolute disaster. One of the worst at harvesting energy, which limits them severely with the overtake and boost modes. Adrian Newey said that they can't even recharge the battery to 250 kilowatts, and for reference, the limit under the new regulations is 350 kilowatts. But even when they're at peak performance with the battery, they're just slow. Lance Stroll said during testing that they're about 4 seconds off the pace, which is just shocking. And unfortunately, the testing times backed it up too. But it's not just the power unit. There seems to be a lot of reliability concerns with the gearbox. They were the only team who didn't complete a race simulation in Bahrain. They only competed 334 laps over the 6 days of testing, which is 252 laps fewer than the next lowest team in Cadillac. It's just a nightmare. And it's a surprising nightmare because this team had so much hope for this year with Adrian Newey leading the charge. And to make matters worse, he's not just the technical director anymore. He's team principal now too, which I think is a huge mistake because now they have a car with all of these problems and he has to divide his time between fixing this car and managing the team. It's just a shocking and very disappointing situation Aston Martin has found themselves in. And I don't have much hope that they'll climb out of it this season. Which leads to the next question I have about the team's future. Will Fernando Alonso make it through the entire season? There have already been some retirement reports floating around, and it wouldn't shock me at all if they became a reality. He's 45 coming into the season. He's going to be 45 in July. It's a shock that he's still driving, but to me, it became very obvious that he was holding on until this year with the hope that Adrian Newey would ace these new regulations and they come into the season as a legitimate title contender and he have one more shot to win some races, to maybe compete for a championship, especially after that taste of success he got in 2023 before things started to fall apart. But those expectations don't look like they're being met this year. And we've seen from Fernando on so many occasions that when the team is struggling and he doesn't believe the results he wants are possible, he can have a tendency to throw in the towel and call it quits. And I think it's very realistic that we're heading towards that point with him very quickly. It's probably not going to be much better for Lance Stroll either. He's just become such an enigma these last few years. Started his career with a lot of success, achieved his first podium in the 8th race of his rookie season, a few more in 2020. But over the last few years, he's just seemed so disinterested in the sport and just hopeless about the outlook of the team and the outlook for his career. And with how things are looking for this year, I have zero expectations of that changing. The good news for the team, though, is they do have Adrian Newey, a proven champion through multiple eras of the sport. But these things take time to fix, and the mountain could not be higher for them to climb with how things are looking right now. All right, let's finish this thing up with some livery rankings and championship predictions. Starting with the liveries, I'm going to start at the bottom with who I think is the worst on track this year, and that's Audi. Really disappointed with what they came out with, and it does look a little bit better on track opposed to what the renderings look like, but just so blocky and just it looks incomplete. And especially after we were teased with the concept livery that was thrown out there I think a couple years ago with the stripes on the side, kind of similar to what we see on the Mercedes car this year, the Audi logo on the side looks so much better than this one. I mean, it just what they came out with. And again, I know this is a new team. You know, a lot of times they don't have as many sponsorships, or they kind of cut some costs and focus on other areas instead of making their car look good, whatever the case may be. This one sucks, and this one's disappointing, and I just was not blown away whatsoever with this Audi livery. So hopefully we've got a few special liveries in store this season, or they at least make some changes, going into next year, but definitely not impressed with what I've seen from them so far, and that's why I've got them number 11 on my rankings. Coming in at number 10, Alpine. A little better than what we saw last year. I'm just not the biggest fan of the pink and the blue together. I guess it looking at it, it does look better than last year. It looks just a little more smooth as far as their transitions between the two colors, but there's just something about it. I don't know. The pink car, the blue, I don't know. I don't like it so much, so that's why I've got it at number 10. I can't really say more than that. But I agree that it's probably more of a personal thing, and there are probably some people who love this livery and probably would put it a little higher on the rankings. Coming in at number 9, I've got McLaren. I don't know what it is about this year's car. It's really not that different than last year's, but there's just something about it that just seems similar to Audi, just a little blocky. And I mean, the orange and the black, they look really, they look good together. They work well together, but I don't know. It feels like there's something missing, and it feels like they could go in, just a little bit of a different direction. Maybe just a little more orange. Maybe that's what it is, and there's too much black on the car. But again, the good thing with McLaren is we know they like their special liveries, so we're not going to see this all year long. We're definitely going to see a few designs as the season goes on. Number 8, Aston Martin. Not really different than what we've seen from them in years past, just that typical Aston Martin green, and in my book, they get a little bit of a bump. And that's probably why I put them ahead of McLaren, just because of that Aston Martin green, how classic it looks, just kind of the history behind that color and this manufacturer. And it's a sleek look, but again, just not a lot that's changed from the last couple years. And, I guess I would like to see them go in a little bit of a different direction, or at least add a little, few changes to the livery. But I've got them at number 8. Number 7, got Ferrari. They get credit for the Ferrari red. That's always going to be a special thing in this sport, but I cannot stand the white and the blue HP logo on the front, the shark fin and whatever you want to call it, and just the middle part of the body of that car. It throws everything off. I wish this car was completely red like we used to see. That's the look that Ferrari needs to stick to. And just this white, I know that I'm sure they're making a lot of money from HP to have this endorsement deal and put this logo on the car, but it doesn't feel like a Ferrari car because of that. And I really would have liked to see them kind of stray away from that, or even just keep it all. I mean, I guess the white makes the HP, stick out, and that's probably why they go with it. But make the whole car red. Use the black HP logo. Do something that just helps it blend a little more instead of looking like we cut out the top half of this car and just plopped on an HP car on top of it. So just for the HP reason alone, I've got Ferrari at number 7. Coming in at number 6, I've got Haas. Really like what they've done with this year's car. Very similar to what we saw last year, but just they've redesigned it in a way where you've got the Haas logo a little more prominent on the side with the side pods. You've got the new Toyota logo on the shark fin part of the car. So really like how this car looks. Again, kind of still looks like a little bit of a vest, looking at it from the top down, but still a lot better than what we've seen. So that's why I've got Haas number 6 on the rankings. Coming in at number 5, I've got Mercedes. There really isn't, they kind of keep things consistent. It's just a few minor changes here and there, but I do like Mercedes. I'm guessing it's they have this partnership with Adidas now. I'm guessing the stripes on the side are kind of a tribute to Adidas and maybe something that Adidas is paying for, but I really like how it looks. I think it gives it a cool look. And it, again, just something a little different. You still have that classic Mercedes look that we've, grown accustomed to, but just looks a little more sleek this year for whatever reason. So that's why I've got Mercedes at number 5. Coming in at number 4, got Williams. Few changes here, mostly with the side pods. They've added this lighter blue color and kind of a white section too, which I think really looks good. I think the colors look really good together and just work really well together. So very happy with how the Williams car looks. Of course, they still have that Duracell battery over the air intake at the top, which I think is probably the best endorsement we've ever seen on a race car of any series. But yeah, overall, really like the look of this thing. Looks very sleek, and yeah, that's why I've got it at number 4. Coming in at number 3, I've got Red Bull. They finally changed some things up. Still the same design, but we've gone with the lighter blue. The numbers have changed. It looks a lot more sleek. It looks like a faster car. Maybe it's just the fact that we haven't seen Red Bull change their livery in so long, and they finally have, and it's like, oh my God, thank God they finally did this. I like it a lot. And I know a lot of other people like it a lot. So definitely a change in the right direction, but still kind of keeping that traditional Red Bull look about them that they've held on. Because even though it's been consistent for 10 years up to this point, that they've just had the same livery over and over and over and over again, it's a very classic look, and it's a very good look just with the bulls on the side, the yellow touch on the nose over the air intake. It's a really good car design, so you don't want to mess it up too much and make too many changes where it takes that away and ruins it. But this was definitely a good change for them and definitely put them in the number 3 spot. Coming in at number 2, got the Racing Bulls. A little different from last year. They got rid of, some of the white, it looks like, and it's just, they've added a little more black to the car, but still primarily a white livery with those same, the same Red Bulls along the side, on the nose, on the air intake, the yellow accents too in both of those sections. But just there's something about a white Red Bull car that just looks incredible, and I love it. It's an incredible look, and it's definitely one of my favorites. So good job on Racing Bulls realizing what they did last year and saying, yeah, let's probably keep that approach. And coming in at number 1 in my livery rankings, give me Cadillac. I was blown away when I saw this livery come out. It came out in a commercial when we were watching the Super Bowl, but I don't know why, but I never really thought of this concept of making, inverting the colors where one side of this car is white, the other side of the car is black, but it just transitions so smoothly. It's not like a clear, that's the biggest problem I have with Alpine. You got the pink and the blue, but it's just a sharp cutoff with that. There's no smooth transition into those colors. And this is just, it blows me away. and it is without a doubt probably one of the best looking liveries I've seen in the sport. Um, Really awesome job for Cadillac. And again, for a team that, the performance probably isn't going to be there this year, get the drivers in there who are going to have the endorsements. Get a great livery to, capitalize on just extra, make the fans fall in love with your team and start following your team and go through those tough moments until you get on your feet. But from a livery standpoint, A plus from Cadillac. So moving on to some championship predictions. Of course, we've got a long season ahead of us. There's a lot that can happen in this season, and there's a lot that can change. We have an idea of how things stand right now coming out of testing, but at the same time, we have to admit we don't really know until we see cars on track in Australia. There could be sandbagging, but, time will tell as to how things play out. But my best educated guess for the Constructors' Championship predictions, coming in at third, I've got Red Bull. I think Max is going to have a really good year. And just a little sneak peek, he's going to be in the contention for my Drivers' Championship too. But I think Max is really going to carry this team to extraordinary heights. And I think Isaac Ajar is really going to carry his weight too, which is something that Red Bull hasn't had in a very long time from their second driver. But I like where this car is starting. I like the people inside the building. I like how they can develop this car throughout the season. And most importantly, I like Max Verstappen behind the wheel. And I think that is going to go a long way. Now, they're going to be at a disadvantage, though, because I think with the other two teams, they have two drivers who can just be a little more consistent. Not more consistent than Max, but just their two drivers are going to be more consistent than Red Bull's two drivers. And they're going to consistently put in better results than Red Bull's two drivers. So that's why I've got Red Bull coming in at number 3. But again, I don't think they're going to be that far off. I think they're ultimately going to get hindered a little bit by Isaac and just adapting to being on the senior team, still dealing with some mistakes, not rookie mistakes, of course, anymore, but just those early career mistakes and that learning curve that's going to come with it. So Red Bull should have a good year, but I've got them number 3 in the Constructors' Championship. But coming in at number 2, give me Mercedes. I think Mercedes is going to have a good year. I think they're going to win a handful of races. I think Kimi Antonelli might even win a few races this year too. But I worry about a few things. First being, they didn't look miles ahead of everyone else like we expected them to be coming into testing. They've got this issue with their fuel supplier. Are they going to have the right fuel to start the season? Will they have to go through a few tough races to kind of, compensate for that until they get things in order? But on top of that, too, this whole engine compression ratio issue. Will that hinder them when the new tests likely start? Although it hasn't been announced, but it seems pretty likely that things are going to be tested in a different way once the summer break starts. So how much is that going to hurt them? But on top of that, too, I worry about George, his ability to handle the pressure of a championship fight. I think it's going to be a hard year for him. He's going to have success. He's going to win races. He's going to be in that fight. But I think it's going to be a tough learning curve and a tough season for him just dealing with that pressure, similar to what we saw from Lando in 2024, similar to what we saw from Oscar last year. That's going to be George this year, in my opinion. I think there are also probably still going to be a few tough moments from Kimi Antonelli. He's going to have a better season. He's going to fix a lot of those mistakes, but I still think there are going to be some errors along the way. There are going to be some races where he's not putting in the performances we would expect him to put in. So all of that together, I think that's going to knock Mercedes down into that second spot in the constructors standings. And coming in at number 1, again, probably going to regret saying this, I've got Ferrari. Their driver lineup is very strong with Leclerc and Lewis, and especially these cars going back into Lewis's direction with his driving style. They look so strong this year, though. They have the speed. They have the reliability. They have the start procedure figured out. They have a lot going for them. And I really think this might be the year that they finally put it all together. And feel free to laugh at me in 2 months if we're running into strategy errors, if this team is completely dropping the ball. But at some point, things are going to change. Ferrari's not going to go the rest of time without winning another championship. Somehow, it's been 20 years, but they're going to get back on top one way or the other. And I have a really good feeling that this year might be the year. So I've got Ferrari winning their first Constructors' Championship in a very long time. Going to the drivers, coming in at number 3, and again, I think this is going to be a very tight championship battle because I think there's going to be a lot of reliability issues along the way, a lot of chaos along the way, a lot of just unexpected moments that really shake things up. It's not going to be, last year was very easy to go into a race weekend and say, well, it's probably going to be McLaren or it's probably going to be Max once he started picking things up at the end of the season. It's going to be a lot harder to predict these races as this season goes on, just with these new regulations and all of these teams trying to figure things out. So, with all of that being said, coming in at number 3 in the driver's standings, got George Russell. And again, I think this is going to come down to just struggles of handling the pressure of a championship fight, because I think he's going to be dealing with 2 other drivers ahead of him that have that experience and know what it's like to go through a championship fight and know what it's like to handle that pressure firsthand. And unfortunately have had moments where they've fallen a little bit short and have not met those expectations and had to learn from those moments. And George hasn't had to learn from those moments yet. So because of all that, because of the other issues, that I brought up with the Mercedes car, fuel, compression ratio, all of that stuff, I've got George coming in 3rd in the standings. Coming in as the runner-up, I've got Charles Leclerc. Again, I have a lot of faith in Ferrari of turning this thing around. I think it's going to be a good year for Charles. And I think, if anything, Lewis, I didn't go below 3, but I think if I had to guess a 4th driver in the standings, I would probably put it as Lewis, because I think Ferrari is going to have a very strong year. But similar to what we saw with McLaren last year, with Oscar stealing some points away from Lando stealing points away from Oscar, the fact that Charles and Lewis will both be in contention for race wins, or should be, and will be at the top getting those consistent points and those big points gains from those results, I think they're going to take a little bit away from each other. And I think because of that, that's going to hurt Charles in the Drivers' Championship and maybe knock him out of the first place position. And it might even be a situation like we've seen with McLaren, notably, where it gets to a point in the season and you've got these 2 drivers and they're close enough and they're close enough to first place in the standings where it's like, all right, do we tell the other driver that, hey, you're the 2nd driver now and we're focusing on this guy, or do we let him race and do we let him fight? It'll be very interesting to see if Ferrari adopts not papaya rules, but whatever they want to call it, but their own version of those rules where they have to prioritize drivers, or they let them race and make sure that they race fairly. But with all that being said, I think it's going to be enough to hurt Charles and bump him out of contention for the Drivers' Championship and just take that championship away, which is going to be a little hard for him because obviously he had that heartbreaking season in 2022 where it looked at the beginning like he was in championship contention, had a significant lead, and just slowly watched it slip away and slip out of his grasp as Max and Red Bull took over. So hopefully for his benefit, I'm wrong, but I have a hard time seeing him actually be the Drivers' Championship this year, or be the Drivers' Champion this year, because who I've got as number 1 is going to be no surprise to anyone. It's Max Verstappen. You can't deny it anymore. Again, I think Max is going to have a very good grasp on this new generation of cars. I think he's going to get the most out of it. He's going to complain. He's going to make a lot of comments in the media about how this isn't real racing, how you can't push flat out, how it's just been a terrible move for F1 to go in this direction. But when it comes to things on track, when it comes to managing these different modes, managing the battery, making sure you're preserving it, getting the most out of the corners, all of that, Max is going to excel. And he's going to have a significant advantage, I think, over the rest of the field in this area. And at the end of the day, he's Max Verstappen. He's the best racer we have on the grid. He's incredible at what he can do and the amount he can pull out of a race car, even when it's not necessarily the best on track. And because of all that, I'm not doubting it this year. I doubted it in previous years when I was probably a little biased and, was rooting for Lando and McLaren and, maybe even Oscar to beat him out and take away his title run. But there's no denying it this year in my mind. Max Verstappen, without a doubt, is the favorite to win the Drivers' Championship. All All right, that'll do it for today's season preview episode. Went a little longer than I expected, but of course, a lot to go over in a season preview. We are, of course, starting the season next weekend in Melbourne for the Australian Grand Prix, so I will be back to the normal schedule of things, doing a preview episode that comes out midweek, a little later in the week before the weekend starts. And then, of course, a recap episode after the Grand Prix, which for me starts late Saturday night. For a lot of people, starts early Sunday morning. But that recap episode will probably be coming out sometime on Sunday, so be on the lookout for that. But I'm excited for the season. I think we're in store for a lot, and it might be chaotic, it might be frustrating at points, but I think it's going to be a very entertaining season as we watch all of these new regulations come into play with this new generation of cars. Thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening. Until next time.